Hello and welcome back to Quaife Engineering. Now today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be talking about the 60 and 69G 6-speed sequential gearboxes. You've probably seen the videos online where we've been doing some testing and development with the Caterham. There's a lot of questions that we do get asked with these gearboxes via email and phone call and Facebook and whatnot. So we thought we'd just do a little bit of a video today just to show you the differences, the applications that both of these gearboxes fit in, and sort of common questions that we get asked. So we'll start with what are the gearboxes and how do they work, those kind of things. So we'll start with the 60G. So the 60G was designed originally to be a direct replacement for the Ford Type 9. So generally Mark 1, Mark 2 Escorts, obviously they're very popular in rally cars over in Ireland. So there was a huge demand for a heavy duty sequential gearbox for those applications. Now this is the most popular gearbox that Quaife have ever done. We've sold just over 1,950, I think we are at the moment, for all sorts of different applications. So the sort of basics of this gearbox, so it's got 80mm shaft centres running EN36 gears. We rate it to around 500 horsepower, so we've got cars using it in with over 500 horsepower with sort of 10-inch wide slicks, so it's a very strong gearbox. Being sequential, it's fairly simple as well, so there's not a lot to them. We'll go over that a bit later on, sort of show you how they work and what goes into the sequential. But really, yeah, so 80mm shaft centres makes it a strong gearbox. It's about 38 kilos, I think, off the top of my head dry. Options on this gearbox, obviously straight cut gears as we've got here. Number of different ratio options that are listed on the website. So we've got obviously direct drive, overdrive, double overdrive, and then we do have helical options as well. Lots of different options for input shafts and fitment packages. Again, I'll show you a little bit more later on about the different input shafts, nose cones, bits and pieces like that. 6-speed sequential, yeah, a really good solid gearbox. So the 69G, which is basically the bigger brother of the 60G, so this has got 90mm shaft centres and this is running on EN39 gears. This gearbox we've had proven, I believe, about 1300 horsepower. Again, a really strong, bulletproof gearbox. So, like I say, 90mm shaft centres, EN39 gears, very similar design to the 60G, just beefed up. So if you're running that higher level of horsepower, then this is the gearbox for you. Slight differences, so this one actually has an inbuilt oil pump with the gears at the back of it. But generally they're fairly similar. Bell housing bolt pattern is slightly different, and obviously mounting points and prop shaft again is slightly different. So yeah, that's a brief overview of the gearboxes. We'll go into a little bit more detail now on the fitment packages and show you what we can offer from that point. So here we've got a very small selection of the different options that we've got for both the 60G and the 69G. Just due to the sheer amount of applications that there are, obviously front engine, rear wheel drive, we cater for the majority of them. If we don't specifically list it on the website, then don't hesitate to contact us, because we can do custom input shafts, custom adapter plates for your specific application. But there are a lot of the most popular applications that we do. For example, here we've got an LS bell housing. So these are more commonly used on the 69G, generally because they're higher horsepower. So we do the input shaft and the bell housing for that, as well as Honda S2000, MX5, 2JZ, 13B, obviously Escorts. So the nice thing about the 60G is that we can supply it with the inch 23 input shaft for your 4-cylinder Escorts, and the bolt pattern on the front of it is the same as a Rocket or a Sierra Type 9, so the bell housing just bolts straight on. So that one's fairly straightforward. So here, obviously there's just different options for the input shafts. I think on the last count of the 69G, there are about 95 different input shafts that we offer, so a huge variety in terms of fitment packages for engines. Also, we've got a number of different options. Again, there's just a few here of different nose cones. So obviously where you've got a bell housing mounted slave cylinder, you just have the blank, where you want a centre push clutch, so a Tilton, AP, Burton, that type of thing. Then we do different nose cones for those as well. One other common change that we have with the gearboxes is obviously the gear lever and the gear lever position. So we've got an example here. So this is the rearward extension lever. So where you've got the gear lever needs to be quite a bit further back in the car. We do an option for an extended gear lever that bolts onto the back of the 60 or the 69G that just gives you that extra depth in the gearbox. There are as well other different options for length of lever. So we do a Caterham one. Because you've got the dash in the Caterham, you need a gear lever that's kinked back. So we do that as an option, as well as a long, short and a slightly angled back version. So no matter the application, we can generally cater for it. Again, if there are weird applications, then let us know and we can certainly have a look at it. So that's just a general view of those. So the next thing we'll talk about is how the gearboxes work. We'll get a little bit more detail on how to change gear with it and how the gears are actually selected, and show you the basics of that. Okay, so let's have a look and see exactly how a 60G works, and this goes for a lot of inline sequentials. The basics are essentially the same. So obviously here we've got the gear lever. Under the gear lever here we've got the claw that selects rotates what we call the Gatling gun. Just looks a bit like a Gatling gun, but there are other terms for it, so index wheel is the correct terminology. So as you pull the gear lever, you can see that the cam drum starts to rotate, the index wheel starts to rotate. What we've got here is the detent, which is basically putting preload on what we call here the daisy wheel, which stops obviously if I pulled the lever now without a detent in there, it would just continually rotate the cam drum. So as you pull the gear lever, it goes over the daisy wheel, the detent then obviously forces it into the next gear. As we move along the cam drum, it works a little bit like a camshaft in a car. So effectively what we've got here is we've got the tracks that the selector forks run in. So as I pull the gear lever, the cam drum rotates, the selector forks move in the tracks, and the selector forks are connected to a drive disc which engages with the dogs on the gear. So it's a constant mesh gearbox, so the gears are rotating constantly, they're all rotating at the same time. It's just what happens when the selector fork and the drive disc engages on the gear. Effectively all that's doing is locking the gear to the main shaft and giving you your gear ratio. So really simple design and effective. There's not a lot in these gearboxes that can go wrong. We'll talk about some of the common issues that people have in a little bit. So things you can see with the gearbox. So we'll go through a number of the different components. So we've got the cam drum here, we've got the selector forks, we've got obviously this inside the selector forks. Running inside the selector forks are the dog rings or the drive discs, people call them different things. Main shaft gears here, so the main shaft gears all have the dogs on. Then we have the lay shaft at the bottom of the gearbox, again with the lay shaft gears on. We've then got the temperature sensor, so both the 60 and the 69G have temperature sensors on them, which can show up on the gear display that we can provide, or you can have, obviously if you've got a DigiDash, you can have your gearbox temperature on there. The potentiometer, which measures the position of the cam drum, is situated here. Again, we can supply these, and if you've got our gear display, you can get a gear display off that, or you can link that up to your wiring loom for your DigiDash. Obviously, input shaft coming out the box here. So 69G is, like we said before, very, very similar, just the bigger brother. The only difference really here is obviously the size of the gears, and this one's got an oil pump. So you've got two little gears that come with the gearbox that are situated in here. If you're running the oil pump, pop the gears in. If you're not running the oil pump, then just leave them out, and obviously they're blocked up with these caps here. Main shaft at the back, as you can see, the 69G comes with a prop shaft flange, which can mate up to your, get a custom prop shaft flange made for the back of this. This is just a Viper spline on the main shaft. and then the 60G doesn't have it, so you can use your standard Ford Type 9 prop shaft or yoke on the back. We do offer a heavy duty version of this, so if you're running sort of 300 brake horsepower upwards, we do recommend that. So the changes with that is that you don't have a bush in here, you actually have needle rollers, and we provide it with a flange, so it's just that bit more supportive at the back end of the tail case. Another part of the 6G we've got is the oil breather here. Now what I would personally recommend everyone does is when they get the gearbox is to remove this and fit a 3/8 BSP hose tail and run it up to a catch tank, because if if the gearbox does get hot or if you slightly overfill it, it will just spit oil out of this breather and it makes a mess. So I'd always recommend just unscrew this, fit a 3/8 BSP hose tail up to a breather bottle, and it will just ensure that you're not causing a mess. The filler level bung is on the side here, so that's where you fill to. The drain plug is on the opposite side, so your drain plug normally situated there. What else can we talk about? So we've got the reverse interlock, the reverse arm here, so never remove that bolt, because otherwise then your reverse arm's just going to flap about everywhere, so don't touch that. The detent here, now this is a critical part. We'll talk about this again on sort of common questions and common issues that people have, but that's your detent that, as I said before, loads up the cam drum. So yeah, we'll move on to common questions and how to drive with a sequential and different options on that next. Okay, so let's talk about how to drive with a sequential and how to use a sequential gearbox. So obviously with a sequential, pulling back goes up the gearbox, pushing away from you goes down the gearbox. Obviously natural when you floor it in your car, you get pushed back in a seat, so the natural thing is to pull back. So we're in neutral at the moment. We're in first gear at the moment. I know this because we can't go forward because the neutral interlock is stopping us going into neutral. Now, the reason we have a neutral interlock rather than a first gear interlock, as some people think it is basically to stop you buzzing your engine. So when you're going down to a corner, you don't obviously want to hit neutral, get on the power, and then goodbye engine. So it's just a safety factor. So with the neutral interlock, it's just a simple lift up of the collar on the gear lever, push forward, and you're in neutral. Push forward again, and you're in reverse. From reverse, you can go all the way up the gearbox. So that the neutral interlock collar is literally just to stop you going from first to neutral. No other time do you need to touch the interlock collar. So obviously just pull back on the gear lever and it changes gear. So how to drive with a sequential and what are the right, the good practices. So if you've got no electronics on the car, then the best way to do it is essentially to load the gear lever. So take the preload of the detent, and you'll feel that it will start to get, you've got a bit of slack there. As soon as it starts to load, you can feel that. And then what happens when you're driving, just lift off the power, and as you lift off the power, the gear lever will just go back and it'll click into the next gear. So hold the gear lever, load it, lift off the power, and it will click in. No need to use the clutch on the way up the gearbox. On the way down the gearbox, we do recommend just dipping the clutch. Obviously if you're heel and towing, that can help as well. But it's just nicer on the gearbox just to use the clutch on the way down. Obviously slow speed stuff, then it's better to use the clutch. Again, you don't need to fully depress the clutch, but just take the load off the gearbox. And all that's doing is the dogs inside the gearbox are dovetailed. So obviously you need the drive disc to disconnect from the gear, and by taking the load off the gearbox, all that does is just disconnect the drive disc from the gear and allows a nicer, smoother gear change. Obviously with no electronics on the gearbox, don't try and flat shift. That's going to cause you a world of pain in terms financially with the gearbox. Flat shifting, so there's a number of different ways you can do this. There's closed loop, there's open loop. Obviously closed loop is the safest way. So basically how that works is you're working off the potentiometer and a load cell on the gear lever. So as you pull the gear lever, it sends a signal to the ECU to cut the ignition, and that can be done in a number of ways, either by cutting the coils, retarding the ignition, bits and pieces like that. We won't go into too much detail on that today. But essentially what you've got is a load cell on the gear lever. As you pull the load cell, as you pull the lever, it sends a signal to the ECU, cuts ignition, and then it won't engage the ignition until the potentiometer on the end of the gearbox sees that it's fully rotated and in the next gear. It's just safer. Obviously there are ways you can do it with a load cell on just a timed cut. A little bit risky, but you know, a lot of people use it, and it's sort of common in the motorsport. So I think that goes over most things. Obviously if you've got any questions, drop them in the comments and we'll come back and we'll answer them. We'll go over next common questions and common faults that people have and how they're solved. So yeah, we'll do that now. Okay, so what are the common questions that we get asked and what are the common faults that people have? So common questions we get asked is how much oil do I need and what oil should I use? So fill up to the oil level. Simple as that. Keep filling until it starts to come out and then put the bung back in. What oil to use? We recommend 75W90 GL5 for obviously for a dog box. GL4 is generally for synchro mesh gearboxes. Some people in hotter climates or cars where the gearbox is getting fairly hot, we've seen it before where people are running exhaust down the side of the cars, the side of the gearbox, and the gearboxes get very hot. So some people do run a 140, which is absolutely fine. So servicing on the gearbox, how often should you service a gearbox? So we recommend once a season or every 24 hours. Obviously that's going to depend on the driver, the use of the gearbox, how mechanically sympathetic they are. Some people, you know, I've known customers to not touch gearboxes for 5-6 years, and then obviously they need quite a lot of work. And then we've got customers that religiously service them every year, and generally it's a bearing and service kit. So again, the electronics can help on that side of it. So although flat shift kits can be expensive, you will save yourself in dog rings and gears and selector forks. So another one of the common things that we see, people mess about with the detent. Now the detent is set out factory. There is a specific way to set that. So unless you really know what you're doing, please don't touch it. But generally the way to set it is to obviously knock this nut off. And then what you do is you find a trough, so you can stick your finger in the hole here and feel the trough. Now what you do then is you wind the detent in until it touches the bottom, and then a quarter of a turn and lock it off. And that detent is set correctly. If you don't set that correctly, you can end up with all sorts of problems, like you pull the gear lever and it changes 2 gears at once because it's not detenting the cam drum. Other problems that we get are people, you know, if you go to change gear and it just jumps 2 gears, that's likely to be the detent. It could also be that you've actually worn the dogs on the gears and there's not enough of a dovetail there to hold the gear in, so it will just jump to the next gear. So if you are finding that it's just jumping, then likelihood is that the gearbox needs to be stripped and serviced because you've worn the dogs out. Damaged pins on the selector forks are other things that we've commonly seen. Now obviously that can only occur when you're getting dog on dog and it's loading the pin and it's basically smashing the pin against the track on the cam drum. Now again, that can be not lifting off in time, trying to flat foot shift without a flat shift kit fitted to it, or you know the electronics, the flat shift kit isn't quite set up correctly. So that dog wear is generally just based off timing on the gear change. Another thing that we see often is people want to put an extension on the gear lever to set it higher. Now this setup here, so the height of the gear lever, the amount of throw on the gear lever, the springs in the gear lever, how heavy the detent is in terms of the spring rate on that, is all calculated. So if you start putting extensions on your gear levers, you're going to run into trouble. Mainly because you're changing the leverage, you're putting more force on the gear lever, which is then in turn going to cause issues in terms of the cam drum. So we have seen it before where people have put big heavy gear knobs on them and they're changing gear and they're saying, oh, the gearbox is changing 2 gears at once now. That's your problem. Go back to the standard one. Like I said before, we do offer different lengths and heights of gear levers, and at that point we change the pivot point here. You need to change the pivot point if you're going to go taller with your gear lever. So just bear that in mind if you do start getting problems like that. D10, or sorry, the interlock is another thing we get asked a lot. How do you set the interlock? So Paul, if you want to come around here. So as I said before, you've got your lift up collar. Now if you look in here, you can see as I pull this, it's just pulling that interlock back. So if we go to, so that at this point we're in first. As I lift up this interlock collar, you see the pin go back in, and there's a step on the cam drum here, which basically when I'm in first, the pin is hitting against that, so it won't let me. So all you're doing is you knock off this nut here and you wind this in or out, depending. So if you get to the point where you're in first gear and you can just go straight forward, it will allow you to rotate. You need to wind this in. If you're getting to the point where you're lifting the collar and it still won't let you go to the neutral, then you just need to wind it back out. It's as simple as that. So normally a turn and a half will be enough to have to force that pin in or out. So it's quite a precise setup on it, but it's a common thing that we do get asked. But when you look at it like this, it's very simple. I think that covers all of the main common questions. So with servicing, we do offer service kits. So we recommend that whenever you pull the gearbox apart, you put a new fresh set of bearings and seals in it. So we keep them on the shelf. So just email us and say, can I have a 60G service kit. It's funny, a lot of people, this is a 60G. A lot of people call it a G60. I think because of the old Mark II Golfs and things like that. We know what you mean, but yeah, it's quite a common thing that they get called a G60 rather than a 60G. So another common question we get asked is, how do we set up the gear display? So here's a Quaife gear display as it comes from us. So this one with the 60 and 69G has a temperature display as well. So you get provided your gear display and a wiring loom that just plugs into the bottom of the gear display. There's a 12 volt ignition live. The black wire is your ground wire, and then the yellow wire is for your reverse light switch. So how do you set up the gear display? So obviously once it's all wired in, push in the red button here for 3 seconds. It will then flash up with 4, 5, 6, 7. Now that's the number of forward gears you've got in your gearbox, obviously not including reverse and neutral. So obviously with this one being a 6-speed, just hit push the button in when you see 6. Then it will show a R for reverse. So at that point you need to select reverse gear. So push it all the way forward, obviously lift your collar, so we're in reverse there. So once you're in reverse, press the button in, then it will say first. Pull the gear lever, push the button in, that's first gear set. So essentially all it's reading is the signal from the potentiometer on the front of the gearbox. So really straightforward. Obviously the temperature will flash up when it gets to, I think it's 105. So anything 105 degrees on both of these gearboxes, we do recommend fitting an oil cooler. So if you're seeing after 3 or 4 laps you're at 105 degrees, then it's too hot for these gearboxes, so consider fitting an oil cooler. I think that covers pretty much everything with both of these gearboxes. Obviously if I have missed anything, then please let us know, and like I say, we'll try and do some more videos on this. We do plan to complete a video of just basic servicing, so I'll get one of the engineers over to give us a hand, and we'll do a basic strip down of a 60G, just to show you the things that we look for, and any technical bits that you may need to know. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.